So welcome back. Thank you very much indeed for coming back. Thank you for coming to the film screening and for supporting the Garden Cinema and the LRB. So much to say about this extraordinary film. Now, I hadn't seen it for quite a few years. I've seen it 2 or 3 times before, but whole sequences, Miles, that I'd completely forgotten. The silence of the film, the craft, the making of the image, the remaking of the image. I'd like to kick off, if I may, by asking you about the nature of Antonioni's framing, what he does with the frame, how he works with colour, whole streets that are red, the famously the green grass in Marion Park that he painted, the sense of of making a reality inside the frame as a photographer. This is a work of cinema. It's a work of art. But it's about the photographic image more than any other form of image telling, shall we say. Can you remember when you first saw it, and can you remember, if you can, the sense of what it told you about what image making could be?
Gosh, well, that's a long question. I guess the overriding takeaway for me from first seeing Blow Up was, the sort of incredibly modern quality of the image making and the pace of the work. It seemed to be like it reminded me of things I'd seen at the Tate more than cinema, in terms of these kind of great sort of swathes of pure colour and abstraction. The way that, as you said famously, that Antonioni had been dissatisfied with the colour of the grass and painted it green. And similarly, that scene that you talk about where he's driving his Rolls Royce past those red buildings, I believe he also added the red paint into some of those sections, so that it was a kind of just fields of abstract colour. You could imagine Antonioni stepping into art galleries of that period, early 60s, and seeing, artists that work in that way, and being inspired and asking, why can't cinema be as, I guess his question was always, why can't cinema be as intellectual as these other art forms? It was obviously, came from being far more about entertainment than sort of intellectualism. The cinema, and so he particularly, with his philosophical approach to storytelling, and to the great sort of existentialist questions of the human condition. You can see that he was dissatisfied with the idea of film as entertainment, and it needed to be far more sort of intellectual and intellectually challenging.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a key. I mean, there are many key ways into the film, if you like, and into that existential quality that you've just described. When Verushka is in the party towards the end, and
Yes.
Thomas Hemming says, "I thought you were in Paris," and she says, "I am in Paris."
Yeah, great line.
Great line. But in a way, it opens this idea to this, to the sense of what we conceive to be reality. Antonioni said, it's not about person versus person, man versus man, as he said. It's about man versus reality. And the question of how we construct reality, the tennis sequence at the end, of course, a perfect example. But when you're thinking about making a photographic image, you're playing with, of course, a narrative that's interrupted at the moment of the photograph. There's a sense of before and after, just as there is in the film that we've seen. You're playing with panels and fields of colour. You're putting a figure into the frame, just as Antonioni does. How do you think about constructing a narrative? And is there an overlap, in a sense, with how you read Blow Up in that construction of a sequence before and beyond your fixed image?
Well, the great difference, although maybe not so much in Antonioni's case, but for me the great difference of making an image rather than making a film is that an image survives because it is not unresolved. Okay, meaning that the image, the photographic image or the painting, we look at a Francis Bacon, for example, we see two people making love or beating the hell out of each other with blood and sperm and fields of colour. We don't fully understand what's going on in this picture, and it's the not understanding that glues us to the work. And as Bacon would say, returns us to life more sort of alive, I suppose. So if you do that in a movie, drives everyone crazy, because people want the movie to resolve. They want to understand why they have sat for 2 hours in the cinema and to be told something. And so we really expect narratives in films to kind of pay off with some kind of philosophy, conclusion, a kind of a moral even. But of course, with Antonioni, you're sort of left hanging there as you are kind of facing this Francis Bacon painting, sort of without really any kind of. It doesn't really conclude. It just takes us a kind of segue into this tennis match.
No, exactly, and I think if I'm right in saying, we start with the opening titles against grass, and we end, of course, with Thomas having disappeared off the grass. It's a loop. We're stuck in a kind of labyrinth of the city. Mm-hmm. He's always passing through endless corridors and doors and courtyards. It's very hard to construct, even in his own studio and living area. You've grown up in the city. You've grown up in the city, absolutely at the time of the making of the film. Can you take us back a little bit to your sense of London growing up and how it's changed? Because we can read this film, particularly early on, through the lens of class and gender and even early gentrification with the shop, the antique shop that he wants to buy. What was your sense of the city growing up in the 60s and early 70s?
Well, that's just a few memories that are maybe pertinent to this film. And I mentioned my father was this kind of he was called the Beardsley in Blue Jeans by somebody, and he was this very young whiz kid illustrator with an airbrush and not a hairbrush, an airbrush, and was doing these sort of fabulous psychedelic images for these bands. And as a young boy, I was sometimes in his charge at the studio, and actually there are a couple of little sculptures in the film, which I think are my dad's, actually, as in Thomas's office. There's 2 little busts of women with kind of bob hairdos, painted in a kind of pop art style. I think they are Alan Aldridge's. So I kind of grew up around, first of all, that kind of studio, of a sort of a white pop art studio with provocative, sexual, violent images around, around white space. That's a kind of a sort of a childhood memory. Very kind of groovy people coming in and out of these corridors and doors that you mentioned, such as Eric Clapton famously drove me to school once for some reason. I don't know. And I remember him driving and taking his hands off the steering wheels and putting them back on again, and kind of as a kind of piece of theatre for me, which is my father couldn't drive, I think, is the reason for that. And then then sort of my father's studio was on the edge of Soho, so there would be kind of like walks around there into kind of the Bar Italia, for example, which of course is still there. But all of the bit around that has changed so much. And of course Soho then was sort of an extraordinary sort of forbidden city of vice and prostitution and so forth, and doors that led into other kind of experiences. And then I'm trying to think of other memories of the city. Oh, I've got another memory of the city. So it begins with Thomas photographing this these down and outs, and I remember for an O-level art project, I went to paint one of these buildings, and my father kind of accompanied me to while I was painting this, doing some studies of this. I think they were called spikes, where the kind of the down and outs stayed. And we was in Camden Town, and we were painting. I was painting, and this bottle kind of came flying out the window and smashed in front of us. So there's a sort of memory of Camden Town having that sort of, as it still does, kind of slightly Dickensian, dangerous quality to it, and and being drawn to that subject. You know.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's striking when you talk about the nature of the sort of studio space with that kind of the sexuality, the violence, perhaps implicit or explicit in some cases, and then this changing city around you as you grow up. I mean, you've seen all the crucial post-war changes since being born in the mid-60s. One thing that's very striking, I think, about the film, you mentioned this idea of the sort of unresolved in Antonioni. I mean, even the title of the film, Blow Up, is constantly repackaged. It's blow up, blow hyphen up. It's blow up in 2 words. It's blow up as 1 word. The credits, the opening titles, suggest that it's blow up in a single sequence. The mirrored nature of those letterings almost throws the film back onto us, which I think you've sort of suggested in your responses, that we have to kind of do the work to make to work, to kind of decipher it. What is your sense of how the kind of the sound works in the film? Because of course a photograph is silent. There are huge stretches, as I mentioned earlier, of absolute silence or quiet in a way that I hadn't remembered. But we're really forced onto the scene. The scene is the priority sense here, which you could argue, of course, is the case in most of cinema, but it really is the case here. When you're constructing a sequence, a series, as you have done with many of your works, do you think about what is going on around in the other sensory environments of the work? Are you very focused on the scene? I mean, like Antonioni, you create storyboards, you draw a lot of your images before, you work on film still predominantly. How do you think about that making in relation to the film, but also in your own practice?
Well, I mean, my photography is certainly has an element of being a homage to cinema in general.
Yeah.
But I think in general, I feel the photographs are just silent.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, what I would say about the film is these incredible swathes of silence feel very like, very, very much like the artist's thinking, and this space of him. There shouldn't be a soundtrack. There shouldn't be sound effects on top of that. The idea of the artist thinking, which I mean, whether I'm an artist of the level of Thomas, I don't know, but I will tell you that I spend most of my day in silence in my studio looking at things, and so that feeling of him putting a print up on the wall and sitting down and just looking at it is very familiar to me. And it's interesting that Antonioni would have done his research and sort of discovered that. I think maybe not just, it's interesting that his neighbour is a painter as well, that also sort of has the same I imagine the same sort of contemplative approach to his work of because the work, I mean, the interesting contradiction about photography is that, of course, it's like we, especially now with our phones, we take pictures like this, without thinking. But the idea really of, and the idea of the camera of this sort of instantaneous moment. But I mean, I like to think that behind these instant moments, there was thinking gone on before, and certainly in my case, that my work is from a slightly. It's not the snapshot, and it's not the reportage photographer, which I have a great respect for those artists like Cartier-Bresson and Don McCullen, who was the photographer that they used for Blow Up to do the photographs, to do Thomas's photographs. But I think certainly with my photography, there is, as you mentioned, drawing and thinking and planning and questioning that happens way before the snapshot. So, I don't know if that's the answer.
No, absolutely. No, thank you. I mean, I'm really interested in what you said about Hemmings, because obviously it's perhaps his greatest performance, certainly the one he would be most well known for. Modelled primarily, as probably we all know, or certainly channeling David Bailey, a friend of yours, someone you know very well.
Yeah.
Bailey himself, in a Time Out feature a few years back, said that he was approached by the producer Carlo Ponti to play the part that Hemmings played.
Okay.
And he said, "You got to be joking," with a few other expletives in between. I'm dyslexic. I can't read a script. There's not a hope.
Interesting.
And then when Ponti, showed him that he saw the film, he said, "What do you think?" He said, "Well, the guy was a middle class boy. That's not how I grew up." He said, and then Ponti said, "Will you sue me? It would be extremely helpful for the film."
Brilliant.
I mean, not that the film needed any help. It was Antonioni's most successful by a very long way and made a lot of money, of course. But Hemmings, for you, really catches that sense of the kind of the tension, the relationship between photographer and subject, the sense of space, the kind of urgency at a certain moment, the kind of acceleration and then a sort of falling away. Does that feel true to you?
I think what's brilliant about Thomas and the Hemmings character, that the way he's done it, and I think only Hemmings could have done it, because I know Terence Stamp was up to play the role as well, and you could also imagine Michael Caine in that role. Another sort of Cockney geezer. I think the difference with those two is that they would have really added the laddishness to it, and the predatory sort of sexual character in there. And Hemmings, he sort of rolls around in that colour paper with these girls, but you don't kind of get the sense that he's a very sexual person. And he's more in his head, and he's not kind of like, I don't know, that's just, maybe I'm being very kind to him, but he doesn't, like Bailey is, has a reputation from that period of, just being a great Lothario, and of course he had so much, ability and opportunity in front of him to do those, to be that kind of guy. So I think what's incredible is that knowing that, the character, that would be a rather unappealing character, I think, even then. There's not much to him. Like, I suppose, Alf, could have been like a sort of version of Alfie with a camera, meaning, but there's a kind of vacuousness to that, I think. And the Hemmings character is so much more you're right. I mean, I'm friends with Bailey, so I don't want to say too much, but I think in an interesting way, I think Hemmings is more my kind of character than Bailey, if that makes. I'm interested in that. I'm interested in Hemmings in that he gets bored with his job as a fashion photographer and goes off to a second-hand shop and tries to find something, but then goes to a park and then finds something else, and is sort of, drifting through his day. I think Bailey is a great photographer of the zeitgeist, and it was bang right there in the middle. And his images of Michael Caine and Bardot and so forth. I mean, they're just legendary. I mean, of course, they're iconic, and they don't need any apology at all.
No, completely. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that, and also about Thomas, because he's not really committed to anything, is he, except the image. Yeah. He's fascinated by, and of course with the photos in the park, obsessed by what lies inside the image, and everything else is kind of a sort of journey, a conduit towards that, the girls and so on. We can't really quite believe his language in a way, or his attitude so much. It all seems performed, which is arguably what the whole film is about, people performing a kind of shared sense or a disparate sense of reality. It's very interesting you mentioned Michael Caine and so on, and Terence Stamp, because Sean Connery was also up for the part.
Wow.
Which is literally impossible for me to imagine.
Yeah,
anyway.
Sure.
But apparently Antonioni, he asked to see the script, and Antonioni refused, and so he refused. But he would have been, fresh out of Bond by that stage, and people would, obviously, he might have been looking for another kind of role, but he wouldn't have got it, clearly, in this case.
I think when Terence Stamp went for the audition, apparently he was reading the parts, and Michelangelo was saying, he was nodding the whole time.
Right.
And then he asked, did I get it? He said, no. It was just his kind of way of listening to him. He was sort of nodding, and misunderstood completely.
Completely. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's a film now, it's 60 years old, and, it's got the status of a classic and so on. You mentioned at the beginning it was very modern, it felt very fresh. When you think about your own cinematic references and bringing them into a kind of, homage and appreciation in your own work, do you think of bodies of work? Do you think of individual films? How do you conceive that relation to cinema in the still image?
Oh, well, I mean, I basically, there was a moment in my life when I was trying to be a video director. And so my way of my way of resolving my sort of lack of talent was to go to the cinema every day. And that was a time when you could. So I would go to the Scala or the Everyman, and to repertory cinema, where they regularly showed triple bills of Godard, Truffaut, Antonioni. And so my idea was that I would go to these screenings, and by the end of the day, having seen 3 films or something, I would have an idea for the pop video, because I would steal something, the tennis match, would take an idea, and then I would write that up in 3 or 4 paragraphs and send that to the record company, and maybe I would get the job, maybe I didn't get the job. If I got the job, I would then have to research it deeper and try and figure it out. But as a consequence, I saw so many films, and so my point of reference is really huge for that reason. But in terms of, I don't know. There's so many. My 3 heroes in terms of image making in cinema would be Hitchcock, Fellini, and David Lynch. Mm-hmm. Okay, but I was thinking of, as I often am, nearly every day, all day, thinking of Federico Fellini while watching the movie, and it struck me that there is something interesting in the conversation between La Dolce Vita and Blow Up, in terms of they're both so episodic, and they both kind of, in a way, carry a sort of magnifying glass across contemporary society, across the zeitgeist. So in Fellini's world, it's slightly early, it's the 50s, and you've got the glamorous American actress coming to town. You've got the religious experience of the children, seeing the Virgin Mary in the tree. It's a story of a journalist seeing these various phenomena of the day. And in the same way, I think Thomas is he's a kind of conduit for all the phenomena of the day, sort of like I don't know, these groovy people at the beginning of the sort of anti-nuclear, I assume so, something like that. There is the people smoking pots. There is the band at the Marquee. I suppose it's the Marquee. So he's kind of like casting a magnifying glass over these and sort of responding to them. I think both films have that same analytical, almost reportage. They're poetic reportage is how I would sort of link them together.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very interesting. Obviously, they knew each other well, and clearly took cinema into bold new directions in their own distinctive way. It's interesting you mention, the anti-nuclear aspect. Very aware of that issue in '66. I'm delighted that Paul Tickell, the filmmaker, is with us, made the Arena documentary about the year 1966, in which the nuclear issue looms very large. And that sense of kind of an instability, not just to the image, of course, which Thomas investigates, but to the society. Are there? We'll all have different versions of this, I guess. But are there senses in which the film has significantly dated for you? You said at the beginning, and I agree with you, it feels very modern in its construction. But are there sort of stretches where you think, no, we're really in a different place now, at the same time acknowledging when it's very present and relevant?
Well, I think the misogyny is hard to avoid. It's the elephant in the room, isn't it? So there's that. And of course, it's a film made in the same time, more or less, as Alfie, and so this is sort of of course that has all changed, and I don't think you get away with being like that these days. A photographer driving a Rolls Royce with a walkie-talkie. I don't know about that either.
No, well, I can't never possibly say. We should say about the Rolls Royce, of course, it's slightly unfortunate to say the least. It was Jimmy Savile's Rolls Royce.
Oh, was it? Okay, wow.
And it was one of only 100 of that model made.
Gosh.
And they sprayed it. They changed the colour, but that's not a good
Savile
connection.
Brown. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it was inspired by an image of Lord Snowdon driving in a Rolls Royce, actually.
Right.
Yeah. So.
In a way,
so Snowdon. Bailey was the next generation after Snowdon's, but you've got Snowdon and Cecil Beaton, and then you get kind of Bailey and Duffy and Conrad.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but also
those
Reg
three, yeah, they're all like working class. So you kind of
Yeah.
went from being a rich man's hobby,
Yes, exactly.
in a way, into sort of being these working class. And my father was very much that same sort of kind of barrow boy from Romford,
Yeah.
who'd come down to London and tried his luck and bluffed his way in. And I think, you know, Bailey was a very similar kind of character.
But that also, that shift, that class shift, is also notable in models, isn't it? As well, of course. Twiggy famously in '66 as well. But that shift across, thinking about models, you know, the fashion models, but also the idea that Bresson thought of his performers as models to be sort of moved around in a certain way.
Yeah, the director.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Robert Bresson. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what you think about how Antonioni works with people in the spaces that he constructs. I'm very aware, as I'm sure we all are in the film, of the verticals, the trees, the beam in the studio, and the horizontals, the grass, etc.
Yeah.
And then these figures, mostly individuals, and sometimes these groups in various ways coming in. And again, you know, what that says to you about your own image construction, but also how people work in space, basically.
Well, I really enjoyed the scene at the Marquee. I mean, I'm going to call it the Marquee. I'm not sure if it's that, but maybe it was the 100 Club. But the way that you enter that scene and everyone's just, you know, transfixed and frozen. And I wondered if Wim Wenders had studied that for his Wings of Desire scene with Nick Cave, which was in a way much more beautiful, beautifully lit anyway. But that was sort of highly staged and sort of highly sort of, you know, synthetic. You know, wasn't real at all. I mean, you know, and I thought that was kind of a brilliant, just a brilliant leap of the imagination by Antonioni. That you know, these young people would be watching this band completely static, you know, and the camera just sort of tracks through them, and then there's this kind of mayhem when the guitar is smashed up and Thomas runs off with it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think earlier, you know, elsewhere you've mentioned that, you know, a woman's face, and I'm thinking now of La Jetée in filmic terms, is, you know, in a way, you know, one of the compelling images for you in cinema, perhaps, but also in photographic work, in that it suggests, of course, you know, a world between the surface, between the look and the face, and then the whole interior life behind. Is your sense of how individuals are framed? I mean, I come back to this again because it really struck me this time. I mean, does it feel productive for you how Thomas films people in terms of the film, photographs people in terms of the film? Because so much of the film is about him photographing somebody else to move us forward narratively. And so we have to believe that, we have to trust that. And I think for many people, perhaps myself included, our sense of a photographer, a fashion photographer, has been informed by his performance.
Very much so. The poster particularly is just a sort of image of, you know, I mean, again, you know, things have changed. But when I started photography, the great fashion photographs were taken by men of women. And, you know, I mean, of course, there's incredible female photographers, Diane Arbus and Cindy Sherman, but they're not fashion photographers. But that sort of history of a man looking through a camera at a woman is the history of fashion photography, actually. And this sort of I think what happens in the movie, what happens in the image, which is the main image for the poster, is this kind of like the camera is placed between the sexual act. The sexual act does not happen. Instead, the camera is slotted in between them, and that the power of this imagination of both parties is captured in this thing. And so when I began photography, as I mentioned earlier, when I started, I fell into it with no talent at all. I found myself in New York photographing the most beautiful women in the world. They were called supermodels. And I couldn't believe I was in, you know, this, I mean, rather like my father was a bluffer, you know, bluffed my way in. And I remember being in a studio in New York and looking through this Mamiya RZ, and Linda Evangelista was on the other side of it, and I thought, can I speak to her? You know, can I talk to her? And so I would tell her, move your head left. She moved her head left. Move your head right. She moved her head right. You know, I said, can you open your mouth? And she opened her mouth. I took the picture, and it was erotic, you know. have this kind of, and that was only because the camera was between us. I would never dream to say this to this person, you know. And that, so I mean, I noticed that in the film is the power. That's what's happening. Is that, you know, in order to be the genius fashion photographer, he sublimates his sexual power to the camera, and he gets the picture. Now, a lesser photographer would put the camera aside and make love to the model, but they wouldn't get the great picture. And my sort of experience of being a photographer is that I was the former. I was so keen to get the picture that I was just I didn't have a sort of huge long sexual Casanova-like career for that reason. So for me to take the picture was always the most important thing, and I gained a nickname through my assistants that I didn't even know about, which was Midnight Miles. And the reason was that I was always in the studio so late, past midnight, trying to get this amazing picture, this iconic picture. For me, it was always more important than getting the model's telephone number. And I remember distinctly arriving, and Mario Testino would be in the studio next to me. And he'd come and wave, and how are you doing? Da, da, da. And then before I'd even done one picture, he was gone. He'd finished for the day. It was very fast. And, you know, we would be in the studio till 4 a.m. Sometimes people they didn't just miss the last train, they missed the first train. You know, we were there so late working on these pictures. So, yeah.
No, it's interesting, Midnight Miles, isn't it? I mean, I guess in the film it would be Twilight Thomas, perhaps, you know, staying a little bit later. You know, you mentioned Linda Evangelista, of course, in Blow Up. We have Verushka, of course, who was the supermodel of her time.
Very much so, yeah.
And the film, as we've already suggested, perhaps in exchanging anecdotes about other personnel who might have been cast, you know, is such a conduit for the whole of the zeitgeist, really, you know, with the actors who might have been in it, the first appearance of Jane Birkin, you know, it's, the sense of the Yardbirds, the band, and just capturing that moment. And, you know,
the cast are incredible, aren't they? I mean, Susanna York.
Of course, exactly.
In a bit part, you know, small part.
Extraordinary. And so it's you know, for now we look back on it as a moment in time, but also, of course, it propels forwards. We're forwards now. We're in 2025. I have no idea what time it is. It could be 1973 for all I know. But it would be great to hear any thoughts from
questions.
any thoughts, comments, responses to the film, to what Miles has said. Anything at all that you'd like to share with us. It would be great to hear. Is there anyone in the room who's never seen the film before? I'd be curious to know if anyone's seeing it for the first time. Right, a good number. That would be the great test, really. What did any of you think of it? If you'd like to share your thoughts with us, we have the hardest working person in show business, Roving Mike, with us. Would anyone like to share their thoughts? It'd be great to hear, if you haven't seen the film before, whether this was the film you thought you were going to see tonight. Anyone would like to? Can I ask a question? Yes, you can, sir. While the others are formulating their responses.
Next.
Could you just use it? Oh, you haven't seen the film? No, perfect.
Sorry, my question, I haven't seen the film before, but it might be a naive question, but what was he doing talking in the walkie-talkie in the car? Who was that to?
Well, I don't know this for sure, but I think obviously he was a very wealthy person, and he had a kind of control centre that you could use for mobile communication at that point, which would be serving a number of people. And so it wasn't that he had his own personal kind of HQ, but that was the way that cars, diplomatic cars, etc., at the time would be, or you know, anybody else with status would be able to communicate and send messages. A pre-car phone. But while you have the mic, would you like to share your thoughts on what you thought of it?
No, I thought it was quite mad. I really enjoyed it. I wasn't quite sure where it was going to go. or how it was going to. At one point, I thought it might be more of a crime type film. He was going to solve, a murder from his picture. And I'm glad Miles spoke about it, because I was quite the bit I was interested in is seeing how a photographer worked and how different his process is from the way I know you work, where you do the drawings, you do the Polaroids, it's all set up, and this seemed very much, as you said, the sort of snap photography that he was going for. I thought that was very different from how you work.
Very much, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Any more thoughts? Any more comments, responses from? Yes, please. So wait for the microphone if you could, just because we are filming, and we'll come to you in a minute. So we're just one behind there. Yeah, thank you.
This wasn't the first time I've seen it, but it was the first time I'd seen it actually in the cinema, and it was it intensifies that intensity you have in watching and concentrating on the film. But what I wanted to say was, what did you think of what Miles and both Miles and Gareth thought of? Because I didn't know until you told me that Don McCullum did the photographs, and that makes a difference. And the photographs of the Doss house are extraordinary. And so, how does that relate? How do you think that relates to Thomas's character? Because it almost seems as though he doesn't know what he has there, in a sense, because they're so good. Because his whole attitude in the first half of the film, until he has this experience of photographing something that he doesn't know is there, then he finds is there and that he's not sure about, is of somebody who's quite superficial, who's seemingly, as you said, with his relationship with the women and everything, just going almost like going through the motion. What did you think of that, and what he was attempting to do there? Because obviously he's going to do a book, and was he attempting to get out of the Thomas character, out of that lifestyle that he was in? Did he feel he was trapped in it?
Shall I answer that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah. So doesn't happen now so much, but the photographers, the sort of legendary photographers, I think of Richard Avedon particularly, who's the legend of the legend, but Bailey too. They weren't just doing fashion photography; they were driven, I think, by each other. Copying each other to also just be great photographers. And so there are books by Bailey which are pure reportage, particularly of the East End and actually Camden Town too. There's another one called NW5. I'm going to say, but that doesn't sound right. Anyway, I digress. But yes, so it fashion photographers at some point just became quite kind of like boring and stuck in just stuck in a studio with clothes and models and so forth. But those photographers actually, they had a much wider vision and much greater ambition. I mean, Richard Avedon particularly, photographed, he wasn't just the greatest fashion photographer, he also was the greatest portraitist and the greatest, he was driven by the history of photography to do the most beautiful reportage. I mean, photographed insane asylums, very similar to these ones by Don McCullum. So those photographers, I don't think they were ever satisfied by just having the beauty. And it really was the beauty and the beast. It was kind of like, and it's interesting that this Thomas character, again, I can say a great parallel with La Dolce Vita. In La Dolce Vita, the journalist, who's a real sort of hack, is trying to write his book, which he never writes. And in the same way, Thomas is trying to do his book of photographs, which of course he doesn't complete because we don't get to the end of the film with the book completed, and he doesn't get his final pictures, which he thought were going to be this couple in the park, And so I think there's something about, the loss of or the failed ambition as well that's coming through in that story. A sort of an inability to complete and be the real artist that they want to be.
No, thank you, Miles. Thank you for the question. I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because so much, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, Miles, but so much of the material of the film is unresolved or incomplete. The propeller is silent. There's no plane attached to it. We see scenes without their sound. Everything is kind of unfinished in the film. And even a sense of the city is incomplete because we can't piece it together. It's one of the great films that people go location hunting for, myself included as a student, to the park. And yet you can't begin to make that city in reality. It doesn't exist, of course, because Antonioni has constructed it such that it doesn't join up, and of course many scenes are not filmed locationally. So that sense of incompletion, of fragmentation, of partiality, I think is really crucial. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Here, you wanted to? Yeah, could you get the microphone? How long have we got? How long have we? One more question. We'll take this question, please. Yeah, thank you. Could you use the microphone, please?
Okay. Oh, I see. Thank you. There was mention of cars, and of course there are two vehicles in the film. There's the Jeep at the beginning, and there's the Rolls Royce. And as I understand it, because I'm a child of the 60s, I knew quite a lot what was going on. And David Hemmings wanted a Jeep. He couldn't afford it. So they got the Jeep for the students in the film, and he hired it to the film to pay for it. But the interesting thing was Pierre Rouvet, who sourced the Rolls Royce. They needed a black one, but it was a white one. And Pierre Rouvet bought it from a then celebrity. I barely mention the name Jimmy Savile. So they had the Rolls Royce painted black, and in those days things were a little lighter in the making of films, and David Hemmings was mischievous, and he spoke to the prop man, and between them they got a bin lid and filled it with bolts and nuts and attached it under the Rolls Royce. And they got a smoke flare under the bonnet. So the film started, and then he had a piece of string, as I understand it, attached to the bin lid. And he pulled it, the smoke went up, the nuts and bolts all of, and Pierre Louvet passed out. Well, if I just go a little further, because what we wonder is what it was all about. What was the film? And in Vanessa Redgrave's autobiography, in her inimitable manner, explained it. I just have a few words here. She says, it was about the unity and difference of essence and phenomena, the conflict between what is objectively and what is seen, heard, or grasped by the individual. There's nothing more than can be said.
Wonderful. What a great way to end.
What a great way to end. Hard to top. Vanessa Redgrave, still with us. What an incredible force in British culture, international cinema. Thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you very much indeed for coming. This is the first in a series. We will hope to continue at the very high end that we have started, with a great film and a great guest and a great conversation. Please stay with us. You'll find details, of course, of the screenings in all the ways you know how, through the LRB and through the Garden Cinema. Many thanks to everyone at the cinema for making this possible. Everyone at the LRB, particularly Sam and Molly at the Garden, particularly to name them. And thank you very much indeed for coming. Stay with us in the season, but please do now thank Miles Aldridge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, do you have a question?
I do. You said the writer of the short story. Was he the man in